What you are watching unfold right now is not just a diplomatic failure, it is something far more consequential. It is the visible collapse of the last credible off-ramp between the United States and a full-scale escalation with Iran, and every single person on this planet who pays an energy bill, fills a gas tank, or buys groceries is about to feel what that means in their own pocket. 21 hours. That is how long the two sides sat across from each other at the Serena Hotel in Islamabad, Pakistan, the highest level face-to-face meeting between Washington and Tehran since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Let that sink in for a moment. Nearly half a century of frozen diplomatic hostility, and when they finally sat down together, they walked away without a deal. J.D. Vance boarded Air Force Two, gave reporters a thumbs-up sign, and the message was unambiguous. The United States came, stated its terms, and Iran said no. Within hours of that departure, President Trump announced a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, the single most important waterway for global energy markets, and deployed additional military assets to the region. The question now is not whether this is serious. The question is whether anyone in Washington truly understands the depth of what they have just set in motion, and whether the American public has any idea how profoundly this is going to reshape their daily lives and the structure of global power for the decade ahead. Now let us slow down and actually understand what happened here, because the mainstream narrative is going to flatten this into a simple story of good guys and bad guys, and that framing is not only intellectually dishonest, it is dangerous. So let us build this picture properly, the way it deserves to be built. The war between the United States and Iran did not begin on February 28, 2026, even though that is the date the bombs started falling. This conflict has been assembled piece by piece over decades, and if you trace the architecture of it honestly, you begin to see that what is happening right now is not an accident, and it is not a surprise to the people who have been watching the deeper currents of geopolitics. The story really starts to accelerate in late December 2025, when Iran's currency collapsed, inflation became unbearable for ordinary Iranian people, and massive nationwide protests erupted, the largest since 1979. The Iranian government responded with mass killings of civilians, with credible estimates ranging from just over 3,000 in the government's own account to as many as 30,000 or more, according to independent Iranian health officials. The United States watched this unfold, encouraged the protesters publicly, and simultaneously began what became the largest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, 2 carrier strike groups, dozens of fighter aircraft, missile defense assets, an armada, as Trump himself called it. All of this was in motion before the first strike ever happened. By the time the bombs fell on February 28th, the infrastructure for a sustained war was already in place. This was not a reactive decision, this was a prepared campaign. What followed was named Operation Epic Fury, and the stated objectives were laid out with remarkable clarity by the Trump administration: destroy Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, annihilate its navy, sever its support for proxy militias across the region, and above all else, ensure Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. Pete Hegseth, serving as Secretary of War, said those words plainly. Iran will never possess a nuclear bomb. Marco Rubio, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Brad Cooper at CENTCOM, all of them said the same thing with the same tone of finality. But here is where it gets complicated, because the gap between what the administration says and what has actually been achieved is wide enough to drive an aircraft carrier through it. Iran's nuclear sites were badly damaged, yes, but the nuclear material itself, more than 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, is believed to be buried underground and remains unaccounted for. The Iranian regime has not collapsed. The Revolutionary Guard still exists. Hezbollah is still firing rockets into Israel from Lebanon, with Israel striking back with devastating intensity, hitting over 200 Hezbollah-affiliated targets in a single 24-hour period just this past weekend. And the Strait of Hormuz, that critical waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil and gas supplies flow, has been effectively under Iranian control since the beginning of this war, with Iran mining the waterway and charging tolls on shipping traffic. None of Trump's original war goals have been fully met. And yet, here we are, 6 weeks into this conflict, with oil prices north of $95 a barrel on the international benchmark, up more than 30% since the war began, and the United States having just walked away from the first real diplomatic attempt to find a path out. Let us talk about the talks themselves, because they are genuinely fascinating from a geopolitical standpoint, and the details reveal a great deal about where both sides actually are. Pakistan hosted these negotiations after doing something quite extraordinary. It managed to position itself as a mediator trusted by both Washington and Tehran simultaneously. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Army Chief Asim Munir were specifically named in both the US and Iranian ceasefire announcements, which is, as one Pakistani security analyst noted, a remarkable concurrence. No other country achieved that. So Pakistan staked enormous diplomatic capital on making this work. The Pakistani side genuinely believed they could bring the two sides together over multiple days of intensive dialogue. When J.D. Vance announced the failure in under 24 hours and immediately left, Pakistani Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar, who had described the talks as intense and constructive, was visibly shocked. The Pakistani hosts had not expected this to end so quickly, and they clearly hoped for a more extended process. That context matters because it tells you that the gap between the two sides was even wider than the Pakistanis had estimated, and they had the most direct access to both delegations. What was Iran actually asking for? This is important because the way these demands are reported in American media typically strips out the reasoning behind them and presents them as pure obstruction. Iran came with a multi-point negotiation plan. They wanted the frozen $6 billion in assets released. They wanted guarantees around their nuclear program, not necessarily the right to a bomb, but the right not to have their civilian energy infrastructure permanently dismantled. They wanted an end to Israel's continued attacks on Hezbollah in Lebanon, because from Tehran's perspective, you cannot ask Iran to accept a permanent ceasefire while its principal ally is being bombed into rubble by Israel every single day. And they wanted the right to charge ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz, which they view as sovereign strategic leverage. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who led the Iranian delegation, said that his country had come to the table with goodwill but with no trust in the opposing side, and that the American team ultimately failed to gain that trust. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson acknowledged partial progress, saying that on some issues mutual understanding had actually been reached, but that 2 or 3 issues remained unresolvable in this session. Now, whatever you think of the Iranian position, the structural point here is significant. These are not the demands of a party that has simply decided never to negotiate. These are the demands of a party that believes the other side is asking for total capitulation while offering nothing durable in return. What was the United States actually asking for? The White House spelled out its non-negotiable red lines with unusual specificity. Iran must dismantle its major nuclear enrichment facilities. It must retrieve and surrender the highly enriched uranium believed to be buried underground, material that exists in quantities sufficient to build multiple warheads. It must accept a broader regional peace framework that includes US allies. It must permanently end funding for Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And it must provide an affirmative commitment, not just a promise, but a verifiable structural commitment that it will not seek a nuclear weapon or even the tools that would allow it to rapidly achieve one. J.D. Vance said those words directly. The simple fact is that the United States needs to see an affirmative commitment. Trump on Truth Social was even more blunt. Most points were agreed to, but the only point that really mattered, nuclear, was not. Now, if you step back from the political theater and look at this from a pure power analysis standpoint, what the United States is asking Iran to do is to permanently surrender its most significant strategic deterrent while the US military continues to operate in the region and while Israel continues to expand its military operations against Iranian-backed forces without any restraint. That is not a negotiation in the traditional diplomatic sense. That is a demand for surrender dressed up in the language of arms control, and Iran's leadership, whatever its many failures and moral crimes against its own people, understands this perfectly well. This is why Ghalibaf, speaking to reporters after returning to Tehran from Islamabad, said something that should be heard carefully. If they fight, we will fight, and if they come forward with logic, we will deal with logic. We will not bow to any threats. That is not the language of a government that is about to fold. That is the language of a government that has made a strategic calculation that capitulation is more dangerous to its survival than continued conflict, and history frankly gives them reason to believe that. When Muammar Gaddafi surrendered Libya's nuclear program in 2003 in exchange for diplomatic normalization with the West, he was dead by 2011, his country destroyed by a NATO military intervention. When Saddam Hussein complied with inspectors and ultimately did not possess weapons of mass destruction, that compliance did not save him or his country. Iran's leadership has studied those cases with great attention. The willingness of the United States to tear up the 2015 nuclear deal, a deal Iran was complying with, only confirmed for Tehran that American guarantees are not permanent. They are as durable as the next election cycle. Meanwhile, as the diplomats were failing in Islamabad, the military dimension was simultaneously escalating in ways that are deeply significant. Two U.S. Navy guided missile destroyers, the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. and the USS Michael Murphy, transited the Strait of Hormuz on Saturday, the first American warships to do so since the war began 6 weeks ago. CENTCOM described this as setting conditions to clear Iranian sea mines from the waterway. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps responded immediately, warning that any military vessels approaching the strait would be dealt with harshly and decisively. Brent crude was sitting at over $95 a barrel at the end of last week, up more than 31% since the war began. US crude was at nearly $97, up more than 44%. These are not abstract numbers. These are numbers that translate directly into what you pay at the pump, what you pay for groceries, what every trucking company in America pays to move goods across the country. The energy market is not waiting for diplomacy to succeed. It is already pricing in the scenario where diplomacy fails. And then there is the question of Israel, which remains the most structurally destabilizing variable in this entire equation. Netanyahu did not mention the Islamabad talks at all in his 13-minute address on Saturday. He said simply that Israel would continue to fight Iran's terror regime and its proxies. Israel struck over 200 Hezbollah-affiliated targets in Lebanon in a single day, while these peace talks were actively underway. This is the paradox that every analyst who is being serious has to confront. You cannot simultaneously ask Iran to accept a ceasefire and allow your closest ally to continue an unrestricted military campaign against Iran's primary strategic partner. Iran made this linkage explicit in its negotiating demands. The United States either cannot or will not enforce any constraint on Israeli operations, and so the two conversations, the diplomatic one happening in a hotel in Islamabad and the military one happening in the skies over Lebanon, are running in direct contradiction to each other. Iran sees this contradiction and concludes, not unreasonably, that the diplomatic track is not genuine. Oman's foreign minister Badr al-Busaidi, speaking after the talks collapsed, said he had had the impression, when he met Vance just before the war started, that there was a genuine preference in Washington to avoid the entanglements of war. He urged the parties to extend the ceasefire and continue talks, saying that success may require everyone to make painful concessions. That is the language of a diplomat who understands how close to the edge everyone is standing. Now let us talk about the global economy, because this is not a story that stays in the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz is the jugular vein of global energy supply. 20% of the world's oil and gas passes through that narrow waterway. When that waterway is contested, when it is mined, when it is controlled by one party demanding tolls, when US warships are transiting under fire conditions, every energy-dependent economy on Earth is affected. Europe is scrambling for energy security. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, one of Trump's closest European allies, traveled to Saudi Arabia to secure energy supplies and publicly said she disagreed with the US position on the war. Ireland held an emergency cabinet meeting to announce fuel tax cuts in response to protests against rising energy costs that were threatening the functioning of the country's emergency services. Supply chains for fertilizers, packaging materials, manufactured goods, all of it is disrupted. One energy analyst quoted in the American press said that into the end of 2026, elevated oil prices are essentially locked in regardless of how the diplomacy plays out, because the variables are simply too large and too unsolved. Think about what that means for inflation in the United States. Think about what it means for every American who is already stretched thin after the inflation of the early part of this decade. The war in the Middle East is not a foreign policy abstraction. It is an economic force pressing directly on the daily lives of ordinary American families. The entire American negotiating team left Islamabad without leaving anyone behind to pursue back-channel discussions. No one stayed in Pakistan. Not Witkoff, not Kushner, not any junior member of the delegation. That is a significant detail, because it signals that Washington is not currently treating this as a multi-round process. They came, they made their terms known, Iran declined, and they left. The ceasefire is fragile and under no institutional mechanism to hold itself together now that the talks have collapsed. What happens next is genuinely uncertain in a way that should concern everyone. Iran's parliament speaker returning to Tehran made clear that the country feels it is under existential pressure and that it will not yield to military intimidation. Trump responded to the collapse by immediately announcing a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and instructing the Navy to interdict every vessel that has paid a toll to Iran. These are not the actions of two sides preparing for a second round of diplomatic engagement. These are the actions of two sides moving back toward direct confrontation. What we are witnessing is a profound test of whether American power in the 21st century can actually achieve its stated objectives. The Trump administration came into this with a theory that overwhelming military force, combined with maximum pressure, would either compel regime change in Tehran or force Iran to surrender its nuclear program entirely. 6 weeks into this war, regime change has not happened. The nuclear material is still unaccounted for. Iran still controls the Strait of Hormuz in practical terms, even as the US Navy challenges that control. Hezbollah is still fighting, and the first serious attempt at diplomacy has just collapsed. That does not mean this ends in catastrophe. Pakistan is still offering its services as mediator. Oman is still urging dialogue. Iran's foreign ministry said it expected back-channel contacts to continue through regional partners. The ceasefire, however frail, has not been formally declared dead. But the trajectory is unmistakably darker than it was 48 hours ago. The window for a negotiated solution is narrowing. The economic cost is compounding every day, and the world is watching to see whether Washington and Tehran can find a way back to the table, or whether what began on February 28th as a military campaign with defined objectives is about to become something far more open-ended and far more costly than anyone, on either side, has publicly acknowledged being prepared to accept.